Well, Senator Tom Cotton is certainly happy right now.
This is a defensive war of survival for Ukraine that was attacked in a war of unprovoked aggression by Russia. President Trump clearly wants to bring this war to a close. He wants a peace agreement. Russia didn't invade when he was president and invaded when President Obama was president, when President Biden was president. But Putin has not been serious about negotiating. So President Trump, in another example of peace through strength, is going to try to help Ukraine get some more battlefield momentum and hopefully bring Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table.
Peace through strength. Hell yeah, brother. Hello and welcome to Colonial Outcasts, the anti-imperialist podcast that imagines U.S. foreign policy as a middle-aged man who refuses to acknowledge he has a receding hairline. As U.S. power projection, both economically and militarily, continues to decline, our steadfast rulers continue to act like we're in our late 20s, not buying jeans that fit anymore, but it was the same cut they used to rock 15 years ago. They're out there buying a Porsche, trying to date younger women so they don't have to come to terms with their own mortality within the context of dying empire, and they refuse to take their hair pills. Now, where is this more apparent than with the war in Ukraine? Russia has 50 days to come to the table, or else President Trump will impose Biden-era sanctions and military support that it hasn't worked for years now. It's just like one more Patriot missile battery, bro. Just one more shipment of 155 howitzer shells is going to turn this whole franchise around. Well, it's not, but the war machine must be fed both here at home and abroad because we have a fiduciary responsibility to wash our tax money out of the public sector and into the privatized military, industrial, media, and academic complex so that we can maximize shareholder returns and make sure that the current CEO of Raytheon, Christopher Kallio, makes even more than $18 million in compensation, because those are last year's numbers and we got to bump those bad boys up. I am your host, Greg Stoker. We are joined for our regular geopolitical episode by Alina Xenofontos, coming to us from Cyprus. With all the flash floods happening in the U.S., I'd rather be in Cyprus, but then again, y'all have your own problems with regards to an unstoppable influx of Zionists settling there after fleeing Israel. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me on, as always, Greg.
All right. Well, today, guys, we are going to be talking about Lebanon, Ukraine, the Axis of Upheaval. You're like, ooh, what's the Axis of Upheaval? Well, we're about to get into it because it's a new foreign policy term that a hawkish think tank came up with, and we're going to see it penetrate into the neoliberal media in real time starting today. So the Axis of Upheaval is like 4 different countries, right? It's China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. But we'll get to that in a second. Because I guess the driving theme of this episode is how capitalism is not great. And I just want to address a few news items to really drill down on that. So another flash flood gets added to the list. First Texas, then New Mexico. Now at least 2 people have died in New Jersey last night, and the New York subway got absolutely flooded. And as someone who, lived in New York, I can assure you that's not normal, but nothing is normal anymore, y'all. In an interview with iPolitics on July 2nd, 2025, David Suzuki, top climate scientist and activist, stated that the fight against climate change is lost and that humanity needs to hunker down and prepare for what's to come. Suzuki's perspective suggests that regardless of mitigation efforts, adaptation to the impacts of climate change is now a critical necessity. This necessitates comprehensive approach that includes building climate-resilient infrastructure, prepping for extreme weather events, and supporting vulnerable communities. But hey, guys, we literally had a fiduciary responsibility to boil the seas, so I guess it's all worth it. We had, in the meantime, a lot of great companies. I would also like to point out that it's hurricane season in Florida, and Alligator Alcatraz is a literal death trap. Everyone in ICE detention there, if they're not relocated when the storm hits, will die. And apparently that's fine because white supremacy demands power over everything, but accountability for nothing. And moving on, I'm sorry, I just need to hit all these news points real quick. The Epstein Files story continues to be the biggest scandal since Watergate, and it's not going away. I already did a whole episode on it at Mint Press and did an interview on Breaking Points about it, so I don't really want to talk about it beyond saying that by not releasing the files or the list, whatever. It was the biggest show of class solidarity I have seen in many years. It doesn't matter if you're neoliberal bourgeoisie or neocon bourgeoisie. We boozy bitches got to stick together and make sure those things never see the light of day. But it demonstrates that over the past 6 months, and here we go, getting into the real episode now, that MAGA movement has undergone a dramatic transformation, shedding what remained of its anti-establishment, anti-war identity, the same populist rhetoric, that once promised an end to forever wars and to put America first, now echoes the neocon consensus it once claimed to oppose. Trump's position on foreign policy, especially regarding Ukraine, NATO, and military spending, have shifted almost point by point to align with the bipartisan war machine entrenched in Washington. Nowhere is this clearer than in Trump's recent remarks on Russia-Ukraine conflict, where he suggested that Moscow has just 50 days to come to the negotiating table or face severe consequences. And this comes in lockstep with a new sanctions bill introduced by Senators Lindsey Graham, Republican, and Richard Blumenthal, Democrat, which introduces aggressive secondary sanctions. And Lena's definitely going to talk about how stupid secondary sanctions are. On countries that do business with Russia. The idea that the U.S. could or should punish nations like China, Germany, India, and Turkey for maintaining economic ties with Moscow reveals the absurd overreach of this strategy and the strategic incoherence at its core. So let's just, before I get your thoughts and commentary, let's just check in with Fox News. See what they're saying about this.
A warning tonight from President Trump to his Russian counterpart regarding putting an end to Russia's war with Ukraine. And the president also announced a new deal with NATO that would send more weapons and air defenses to Ukraine within days. Now, Fox's Jillian Turner is at the State Department tonight with the latest.
We've made a deal today where we are going to be sending them weapons and they're going to be paying for them. We're not buying it, but we will manufacture it and they're going to be paying for it.
President Trump announced a deal for the U.S. to send weapons to NATO to ultimately aid Ukraine, paid for by the alliance. The president also threatened to slap Russia with punishing new tariffs if a peace deal with Ukraine isn't reached over the coming weeks.
I use trade for a lot of things, but it's great for settling wars.
The president made that announcement alongside NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in Washington at the White House.
So if I was Vladimir Putin today, I would reconsider whether I should not take negotiations about Ukraine more seriously than I was doing at the moment.
Meanwhile, Trump's...
Oh my God, that's Mark Rutte of NATO, who's now forever infamous for calling Trump daddy. Real quick,
daddy.
Special envoy to Ukraine and Russia met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv Monday as Russia kept up its drone attacks overnight and into the morning.
The president has been optimistic regarding diplomacy. That has been his commitment. It remains his commitment. But he's also a realist.
Well, these new tariffs would target Russia's trading partners, the idea being to isolate Moscow on the global economy. At the State Department, Jillian Turner, Fox News.
Former President Joe Biden has fired back at critics over his use of an auto pen device to sign pardons.
Okay, yeah. So there's a new Biden conspiracy going on about the auto pen device. We're not going to get into it, but it's just really demonstrative that they'll talk about anything the former administration in order to not hold President Trump accountable for completely flipping on his campaign platform.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, this was anticipated, especially. I mean, we spoke about this extensively on Colonial Outcasts, and what we had initially said, even with regards to Russia, and we never mentioned the Epstein list, but that was to be anticipated in of itself, is that Trump was essentially capitalizing on the anti-establishment, the anti-globalization sort of stance of the vast majority of the MAGA support base, and obviously that included, an anti-war stance, non-interventionism, and a focus on making America great again, basically meaning reindustrializing the United States, bringing work back to the people of the United States, and obviously allowing the United States and its working class to be able to prosper following decades worth of, neoliberal economic policies that have had a massive detrimental impact on the working class in the US. Effectively, we had all argued, and we can get into the nuance of it now, that this wasn't obviously going to happen, because even when we go back to Trump's initial sort of his campaign, Ukraine. So if we're going to double down on Ukraine, he kept stating that, this war in Ukraine needs to end. If he was in power, this would have never happened. He was using the same sort of tropes that he always tends to use, but he never actually got down to explaining the means by which he was actually going to do so. And the only thing he was sort of vaguely, express with regards to, I guess, providing some sort of framework as to what he actually anticipated on doing was that he was essentially going to freeze the conflict, allow sort of like, peacekeeping forces inside Ukraine. Never really got into like the logistics of how that would actually be possible.
Right.
And
Because he was basically just banking on the force of his like personality and charismatic authority to like shift Putin somehow.
I don't even think he was banking on that. My humble opinion is that, Trump was just playing into the narrative. He was playing into the reactionary aspects of American society, but also the genuine, like I said, the genuine demands, wants, needs, and grievances of the American working class. And so he was saying whatever was necessary in order to bring him into a position of power. And Trump as well has played his part in sort of like the balancing act between this, the so-called democracy within the US, between the Democrats and the Republicans, or sort of the two-party dictatorship that exists in the US, and the idea that there are these differences depending on who you're going to vote. He did his part through the main campaign points that he was advocating for. But like I had said before, when you start looking at Trump's policies, even in his first term, I mean, he was the one that set the stage for Ukraine in order to be able to, go to war eventually with Russia. He was the one that had actually enabled the use of lethal weapons or to be sent to Ukraine back in 2019. And so, and this was part of the long-term strategy going back from pretty much 2008 onwards, based on obviously a lot of the classified documents that we have, and intelligence documents that we've already discussed on other obviously episodes. I don't want to get into that, but we already saw that. And there has been a long-term strategy with regards to Russia and Ukraine and sort of the relationships, and essentially how Ukraine would be used as a form of, I guess, a way to antagonize Russia for, U.S. Capital's interests. And so Trump was just merely continuing that that pathway, which again we saw in 2019, and therefore he hadn't really shown any signs that would particularly change. And again, this is also, you could also add, his policy on Syria as well as Venezuela and Bolivia to show that he was somebody that was, he did, instigate, whether it was economic warfare or direct military action against, sovereign states in order to, continue the U.S. foreign policy of imperialism within these countries. So he was never going to offer an alternative. Now, when we start looking at, the current situation in Ukraine and what Trump has essentially offered, I mean, based on this Fox News sort of segment, the diplomatic route has been taken. See, this was the entire point to begin with. He capitalized on people's wants. He came into power, and the entire narrative here was to put Trump in a position to say, listen, we want to engage in negotiations with Russia. We want to bring peace, therefore appeasing the people. And it was always going to be a non-starter of an, the Trump was always going to offer Russia propositions that were going to basically not meet the demands of Russia that haven't really changed in the last 10 years, I would say. And then eventually to state that Russia is a negotiable diplomatic actor, and that effectively, he has no choice at this point but to continue the war and to justify the war to the American people. Because the Ukrainian war, and I'll just finish off here and I'll let you say where you're, and I can see you want to say something, but the American people pretty much since 2022, although there was a momentum at the beginning to support the Ukrainian war and to reaffirm Western values and to help, the defenseless Ukrainian people, et cetera, that momentum began to fade, pretty much 6 months to about a year into the war, seeing the economic, repercussions it was having on the working class in the U.S., seeing billions upon billions being shipped over to Ukraine in Europe and from Europe and the United States. And so seeing also the impacts of, the current crisis that capitalism is in the U.S., and seeing so much of their tax money being given to war in Ukraine that they see has nothing to do with them, it was losing popularity. So Trump has taken that and he's now basically trying to justify the war to this voter base by saying this is the only solution.
And because he's kind of like deified himself as a cult object, if Putin's not being nice to Trump, he deserves to go. But here's the thing: the Russian position was laid out in June of last year. Obviously, before that, and of course, they've had grievances against NATO expansionism for a long time. But Russia's demands for ending the war in Ukraine include territorial concessions, Ukrainian neutrality, and restrictions on its military capabilities. Specifically, Russia demands the ceding of Ukrainian territory, including regions not fully under its control, and Kyiv's agreement to not pursue NATO membership. They also seek limitations on Ukraine's armed forces and weapons systems, effectively aiming to demilitarize and neutralize Ukraine. And why would they, within the context of great power politics, back down from that position? They're winning, and there's nothing that we've been able to do to slow the methodical, brutal, grinding advance of Russian gains inside Ukraine. And, so Trump talked about the, sending more weapons that we've already sent, introducing secondary sanctions, which we'll get into. But that was yesterday, where he met with, General Rutte of NATO in the Oval Office. And this is kind of Russia's only response. They're taking some time to kind of analyze his remarks and come out with like a cohesive public statement. But today, Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president and prime minister, who's now the deputy chairman of the country's Security Council, wrote on social media that the Kremlin was unmoved by what he called Trump's theatrical ultimatum. Quote, "The world shuddered, expecting the consequences," wrote Medvedev, including who during Moscow's full-scale war in Ukraine has become known particularly hawkish voice within Putin's security establishment. Belligerent Europe was disappointed. Russia didn't care. So the Kremlin also on Tuesday dismissed reports first published by the by WAPO, Washington Post, and the Financial Times that Trump asked Ukrainian President Zelensky if Ukrainian forces could strike Moscow and St. Petersburg. Look, none of this is going to work. What's the definition of insanity, guys? Trying the same thing over and over and expecting different results. But I guess from one perspective, the goal of U.S. wars isn't to accomplish strategic public goals that you state. It's just to keep it going forever. And, they'll keep this one going forever. They'll continue to destabilize the Middle East. We'll talk about Lebanon here at the end. And then we're waging a forever war in our own country, too, with ICE and this unwinnable war against immigration. So this is all more of the same thing. I think a lot of military commentators, I don't want to name names, but you know who they are, thought that Trump would be a peace candidate. And that's only because they don't understand the overriding powers and dynamics that underpin our entire economic and political system. So this is not surprising to us. We were talking about this last year when Trump campaigned on this platform. We're like, no, this is all going to go back to Biden era policies. And now we're seeing that it's finally point by point aligned with every other U.S. administration that's come before it. And so, guys, I wanted to, before Alina really dives into like the tariffs and different aspects of the Ukraine war and Lebanon, I just wanted to point out that we have a new term that's dropped within the defense space of the United States. So there's a think tank, and it's rising in prominence now. It's called Center for a New American Security, CNAS, CNAS. It's a think tank based in Washington, D.C., specializing in United States national security issues, including terrorism, irregular warfare, the future of the U.S. military, etc., the emergence of Asia as a global power, and, war games pitting the U.S. against the People's Republic of China, and national security implications of, natural resource consumption, etc. So the Center for a New American Strategy has strong ties to the Democratic Party. It was founded in 2007 by Michel Fournoy, who served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy under Clinton, and then for Policy under Obama. And, also during the Biden administration. And the Obama administration hired several CNAS employees for key positions. In June 2009, the Washington Post wrote that Obama-era CNAS may emerge as Washington's go-to think tank on military affairs, and it's finally come to fruition. CNAS was formerly led by CEO Victoria Nuland, who served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 2021 to 2024 in the Biden administration State Department. And the reason I'm going on about CNAS is because they're crafting policy, both for the Biden and the Trump administration. And they have termed this think tank, Center for New American Strategy, has coined the term Axis of Upheaval. They did it last year, and the Axis of Upheaval is a term coined in 2024 by foreign policy analysts Richard Fontaine and Andrea Taylor, and used by many foreign policy analysts, military officials, and international groups to describe the growing anti-Western collaboration between Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea, beginning in the early 2020s. It has also been called the axis of autocracies, the quartet of chaos, the deadly quartet, or CRINK. So the loose alliance generally represented itself in diplomatic addresses, the public statements of anti-hegemony and anti-imperialist coalitions with intentions to challenge what it deemed to be a Western-dominated global order, to reshape international relations into a multipolar order according to their own shared interests. While not a formal bloc, these nations have increasingly coordinated their economic, military, and diplomatic efforts, making strong efforts to aid each other to undermine Western influence. This is a thing now. The Axis of Upheaval, you're going to see it, and we're already seeing it creep into our news media, because this is just how it works. This is why we don't call it the military-industrial complex. We call it the military-industrial media academic complex. People add intelligence and other things to that, but I just want to do a demonstration about how this is already shaping out. So we have this Axis of Upheaval, and we're going to be focusing mostly on Ukraine right now, but hang on. Yes, breaking in Reuters today. We're already seeing it enter the neoliberal media. Russia, Iran, and China intensifying life-threatening operations in UK, police say. That's insane. Russia, Iran, and China are behind a growing number of life-threatening operations in Britain, including attacks and kidnappings, often deploying criminals and sometimes children as proxies, 2 senior British police officers said on Tuesday. The British authorities in recent years have repeatedly voiced concern at what they said was malign activity by the 3 states in Britain, ranging from traditional espionage and actions to undermine the state to sabotage and assassinations, all completely baseless, all to gin up support against this Axis of Upheaval. And this is kind of why I think we're probably in World War III in some ways.
No, there's a lot of things that I want to say. So I'm going to start off by kind of continuing from what you said. I have been arguing that we have been in World War III since pretty much, I would say, 2022. And there is a reason for that. When we actually start looking at the entire sort of the special military operation that was initiated by Russia, and then we start looking at Ukraine and the conflict and how it has evolved, the fact that over 15 nations, or actually the entirety of NATO, the way it's arming, funding, Ukraine as a state, Ukraine as a military structure, but also the fact that we had ample sort of reports, even coming out of French, particularly I think European media, German and French media, of NATO commanders and British military inside of Ukraine that were conducting operations, and like I said, even for things like long range missiles, etc. That the UK was constantly pushing for. All of this was a combination of NATO states coming together at war with Russia. This means at this point we're talking about several states, key states, the entirety of the Western world, Russia, the US, basically at war with each other. But there's other aspects when we're talking about World War. People often think about it in terms of, military conflict, but it's not just military. When we're talking about war is also economic. When we're looking at the sanctions, the way sanctions operate, the way that Russia was sanctioned, but the impact that the Russian sanctions had, it wasn't just on Russia itself. It was actually more so on the entirety of the European Union. It wasn't even on the African continent because, for example, we know that, fertilizers and agricultural produce were, predominantly coming from Russia into the African continent, who needed that in order to be able to, because they're agricultural-based economies, and therefore they needed these resources in order to be able to continue being able to produce themselves. This had detrimental impacts on their economies. It had detrimental impacts on West Asia and on the South. And, even when you're looking at what's happening in the Middle East and what had been happening, in West Asia since pretty much 2011, and how Russia was connected to that, how Iran was connected to that, it has been a world war for a while. And I would say it particularly became that case from 2022 onwards. But people often think, when they're thinking about a World War situation, sort of chaotic scenes of violence happening at the same time all over the world. I mean, at this point, there are a lot of those scenes happening anyway throughout multiple areas or locations around the world, but it's also the economic repercussions that it's having even on states that appear somewhat peaceful. Let's just say the countries in the imperial core, such as the European Union, for example, or I wouldn't say the United States looks peaceful at the moment, but it's not in an open, I guess, war with other countries directly anyway. So yes, it has. I think it's easy, and I think we should be calling the current state of the world as we are in a World War III situation. I also did want to say something before we get into like the concept of the sanctions and the tariffs and the secondary sanctions. I did want to also say this. And, you said earlier, there's the fact that the United States keeps trying to do the same thing over and over again, expecting to succeed something in Russia. And it seems almost, insanity. That's quite literally the definition of it. But this is the situation. One of the main there's multiple different reasons that the war in Russia is essentially happening. Obviously, it was always to sort of antagonize Russia, to deplete Russia, weaken it. Like I said multiple times before, Russia's a rich country in its own resources. It's strategically important as well, and it's fundamental to sort of break down Russia, take over the resources that it has, because the capitalists, let's just say, and the corporate interests would gain mass profits from being able to control the resources, gas and oil and other mineral and agricultural resources that Russia has. Because like I said multiple times, if you have access to the vast majority of the world's resources, you're able to control the global economy. And then through that, you're able to isolate, target, and abuse that power in order to, target your enemies, which in this case, for example, could also be China. So, there was that aspect behind it. But there's another angle here as well, which you also touched on. And, that is obviously the funding of the military industrial complex itself. The fact that obviously, the defense industry, just some of the largest, corporations in the world, require war in order to be able to continue their profit, to increase their profit margins by far. The war in Ukraine right now, for example, as well as the rest of the wars within West Asia, have, skyrocketed profits over 300% for the vast majority of these, the big four, big five defense companies, who themselves, you have all these massive organized, sort of other private companies like BlackRock and Vanguard, for example, these investment firms who are, the largest in the world, who have direct investment in these industrial, defense companies. And, obviously the web here of how capitalism works is very, very intricate, and I can't get into the totality of it, but it is a money-making mechanism. But the other aspect, the third aspect I would say as well, is fundamentally because of it was the wars that are currently taking place also help to deplete and deal with capitalism's overproduction crisis. And I keep reiterating this point because that's something that a lot of people don't understand, and I think it's important to understand, especially if we're trying to assess global phenomenon from the angle of systemic analysis. At the end of the day, when you have demand is constantly at a stable or decreasing, and obviously the vast capitalism is driven by profit incentives, that profit will obviously, it would decrease over time. And we've seen that happen as a result of the overproduction crisis, due to the fact that production and profit-driven production is at a faster pace than that which of the, social conditions and the material realities of the average working class person throughout the world, not just in the imperial core. A lot of the wars that we're also seeing are having a detrimental impact on the destruction of major resources that the capitalists are then able to abuse in order to essentially continue to increase their profit margins. So it's a very, the reason that they're pushing for this war is because it it drives their profits, it drives the capitalist class, and it keeps them in a position of power. And I just wanted to clarify that, and then I can get into the rest of everything now.
Yeah, I mean, I do have to say there's one other reason for. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for the war, but what a big
There's a
one.
lot of reasons.
A big one that I wanted to bring up, because it's going to bring in the Gulf states, is Ukraine is fundamentally an open air weapons test. It is. The U.S. has been wanting to test out drone warfare and AI driven predictive warfare without actually involving U.S. troops, and that is ultimately aimed at a conflict over the Strait of Taiwan. Like, we don't want to be figuring out the ins and outs of drone warfare with U.S. troops. If we can use a proxy to do it, we're going to do it. And that, of course, is fed back into the whole system, the military industrial complex, getting these massive grants for research and development for how to wage drone warfare in a way that can rival China. Of course, Palantir is one of the leading fronts for AI predictive warfare. They're using Lavender and other programs for targeting in Gaza, stuff like that. And of course, it all redounds back to Ukraine. And they're going to also keep this war going because AI-driven warfare is not something that it really existed when Russia started its special military operation. It was in its infancy. They'd been working on it for decades, but now it's actually here. And, it was first really tested out in Gaza, and now they're trying to see what battlefield applications it can have going forward with large-scale, high-intensity conflicts, because that's what the war in Ukraine is. It's a hick fight, high-intensity conflict, which is something you cannot apply to Gaza because it's not conventional militaries fighting conventional militaries. It's basically they're just carpet bombing everything in population heat maps. So war in Ukraine is actually really important for the defense sector, and everybody's looking at it. China as well, North Korea, Iran, Russia. Everyone's looking at this open air weapons test and trying to get an advantage on everybody else. And of course, the U.S. Is going to leverage a couple initiatives to help out with Ukraine and to feed the war machine. And so we brought this up. Elena, you and I have talked multiple times about, the U.S. investment in Gulf states with regards to the AI sector to rival China. And we're going to bring up one of our favorite think tanks here at Colonial Outcast, the intelligence cutout known as the Atlantic Council. So, with all that being said about the open air weapons test, let's go to Ukraine can benefit from growing tech ties between the Gulf states and the U.S. The recent conflict between Israel and Iran has shaken Middle Eastern security assumptions and set the stage for new strategic alignments across the region. Okay, buddy, sure. Amid escalating threats and shifting power dynamics, the United States and Gulf nations have moved swiftly to fortify a different kind of alliance, one anchored not in oil prices or arms sales, but in cooperation to develop and implement cutting-edge technologies. This emerging U.S. Gulf tech partnership is not only a response to regional instability, but also a platform for global influence. For Ukraine, it presents a strategically exciting opportunity to deepen engagement with both Washington and Gulf nations while also advancing the country's own recovery and integration into established international innovation networks. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is it's quite an ambitious sort of policy paper, I will say that. I mean, the reality of the situation is, I don't know, I think we had discussed it yesterday as well when I had initially read the paper. And, it's the fact that, they honestly believe that, we've said this before, that, Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states are somehow going to bypass China in terms of becoming this AI or, high-tech hub when they don't even have the kind of, expertise. They haven't got the experience that China has. I mean, like I've said multiple times before, China is leading the vast majority of these industries, but also the fact that Ukraine is going to play some sort of substantial role, and the whole idea of building some sort of AI hub within Ukraine itself, or the idea, exchanging programs with Ukrainian, intellectuals and bringing them over to the Gulf states and vice versa. I mean, the reality of the situation is that Ukraine is a completely destroyed economy. It has become a colony of the financial ruling class in the West. The vast majority of Ukrainians, well, the vast majority, but probably half, if not more, have actually left Ukraine. There's been a massive brain drain anyway out of Ukraine as it is. And given the fact that the impacts of the impacts of the war on the Ukrainian working class, the fact that, for example, at the beginning stages, which was back in 2022, Zelensky had actually put into practice legislation that had pretty much eradicated the vast majority of labor protection laws, allowing the vast majority of Ukrainians to be exploited by foreign corporations that are going to come into Ukraine, essentially monopolizing the market and not really having much of a legal structure or basis to protect the Ukrainian population from capitalist exploitation. It's going to become truthfully just a colonized country that's going to be taken for all it's going to be exploited. And so this policy paper and the way that it sort of is approaching the so-called creating this hub in the Gulf states, and somehow Ukraine itself is going to become a significant partner in this process when the state of Ukraine itself is collapsing.
Yeah, that's one of the
Ukrainian
things
talent.
too. It's because like they've lost a generation from this war. Like either they died, either they're in the fight. The military age men are they fled and are living as expats, not trying to fight in the war. I mean, I was living in India, and there's plenty of Russians doing the same thing, but there's a huge population difference between Russia and Ukraine, and you can't really compete with Russia's manpower. But yeah, there's huge brain drain. They fled the country. So when the Atlantic Council puts out something like, second, Ukraine must invest in human capital by expanding tech education and exchange programs that connect Ukrainian talent with innovation centers in the Gulf and the United States. Thirdly, Kyiv should position itself as a proactive contributor to this emerging innovation bloc, not just as a beneficiary of international aid, but as a co-creator of strategic value. I mean, yeah. So this is this kind of policy. It's just fundamental. I can see why they're trying it. It's not going to work. It's too late in the game to build AI infrastructure and an AI tech hub from scratch. In a way that can in any way meaningfully compete with China. But I understand why they're doing it. The United States and the West wants to bring the Gulf states, who are generally like fence sitters, more towards Western interests than developing new relationships with China and what they consider the axis of upheaval.
I was still going to say something. One of the main problems as well that the United States and the West have is the lack of investment in research and development, fundamentally because it doesn't really drive, it cuts through their profits a lot, especially for a lot of these sort of tech corporations.
Exactly.
So this is one of the advantages that, China has. There's massive investments in terms of educating their populations. I mean, right now, Trump is actually just completely destroying the education department in the U.S. I mean,
just laid off 1,400 personnel at the Department of Education.
Exactly. This is completely contradictory to what it is that they're trying to even accomplish. Because if you want to create these sort of AI hubs, if you want to create something that's actually going to really rival what China is putting on the table in terms of like the skill set and its advancements that it's making, you have to also invest in your education. You have to invest in your younger populations. You have to create a sort of force that is able to be, to engage in sort of research that's going to advance. You need that brain, like sort of brain capacity in order to be able to do so. And one of the reasons that the United States, rather China, has taken over the vast majority of the research in AI specifically, as well as other high tech sort of other aspects of high tech in that industry, is because China is actively investing in this industry. Whereas in the United States, the vast majority of its money goes into, foreign wars and funding, paramilitaries and insurgency operations abroad, and finding ways to cheat the system in order to be able to kind of monopolize power and sustain their profits. Because if, like I said many times on this channel, if they were to begin to invest significantly in research and development, that would cut through their profit margins in a way that it wouldn't allow them to assert the same degree of sort of imperial control, and they do not want that. So I don't, and Saudi Arabia, for its own part, although there's a lot of money in Saudi Arabia, and especially within the Gulf monarchies, a lot of that of which is invested for the most part, if not like about half that's invested in Western capital. The other, none of that again is sort of is filtered into creating, and they do not have that kind of investment in sort of research and development infrastructure, particularly in high tech. So to be able to actually catch up to China, which is proven over and over again how quickly they're able to sort of make advancements and how adaptable they are, I think is going to be a difficult task to manage. And then to somehow expect Ukraine to play a significant role in this when Ukraine itself is barely a functioning state.
Well, what they're trying to do is, because they're envisioning this axis of upheaval, so they're trying to build their own, allies. This complete like Western front, and as comprador Gulf state governments, they want to use the Gulf states to secure the entire region. And we're going to talk about Lebanon and the Gulf states' involvement in that, and the security situation in Syria and everything like that. But they're basically trying to pacify the entire region, West Asia, which sits at the confluence of 3 different continents and is arguably one of the most strategically important places on the planet, especially when you figure in like the Suez Canal and certain trade lines and stuff like that, and certain plans for large-scale regional infrastructure like the IMEC corridor, et cetera, et cetera. They need to secure that, and they also want to secure Ukraine as a bastion against Russian expansionism as they see it. And so they're trying to build this massive coalition. And this is kind of why the entire policy position of the U.S., especially under the Trump administration, is insane. Because like what Trump is threatening now, secondary tariffs against anyone who does business with Russia, which is insane. BRICS is full of its own inherent contradictions. I think we talked about India last week and how it's not the best BRICS member, but India has maintained trade relationships with Russia since the Cold War, and they've always maintained what they called strategic autonomy, whereas they cultivate a free market relationship with the United States and trade with Russia, and they stay out of Cold War politics. Now, if the U.S. wants to like tariff India, hit them with secondary tariffs, we literally risk losing one of our greatest regional strategic partners against China too. Like the entire position of all these things the US is doing is completely incoherent strategically, as I said, but also like they know that it's not sustainable. This is Marco Rubio from last month when China and Brazil signed that 20-year trade agreement.
Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to, from now on, do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States. We won't have to talk about sanctions in 5 years because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar that we won't have the ability to sanction them.
小红书.
So, yeah, so they know, like Marco Rubio, a lot of these people aren't stupid. They're just not. They're just driven by this ideology, and they know the game is not sustainable, but I guess they're going to keep playing it and ride this thing out to the bitter end.
Right. So when we start looking at the neoliberal policies that became popularized following Reagan and Thatcher, obviously, in the 80s and 90s, I mean, the entire purpose of them, as well as obviously the Bretton Woods agreement, among other things, the idea was to be able to kind of, maintain, like I said multiple times before, maintain profit margins and keep the wealth within the hands of the ruling class by essentially being able to exploit the global the economic discrepancies around the world. And that is eventually how they were able to kind of neo-colonize through finance that, financial colonization of the global south that allowed them to further be able to cripple their economies. And so many of these corporations in the West can then enter into global south states and be able to kind of take advantage of their resources and their labor force for dead cheap, therefore sustaining their profit margins that wouldn't be possible if they maintained a lot of, for example, of their industries within home base. That is, for example, in the United States. So this is, but one of the problems that this creates in the long run, then the reason I'm bringing this up is to kind of highlight the contradictions of globalization, but particularly when we say globalization, we mean capitalism and how it operates. Is the more that they started to engage in these sort of behaviors, they actually created independent economies, whether it be China, because China as well. I mean, the United States was able to keep its economy afloat for many decades because it was relying on the cheap labor and sources that were coming out of China. But as a result, we're seeing China, Taiwan, we're seeing, even Vietnam. We're seeing so many other countries around the globe that have been able to grow and develop specialized industries, and now they're rivaling, particularly China, the West, that has lost all its industrial capacity and its ability to be self-sustainable in any way, shape, or form. And so, in order to combat that, they then began to use sanctions warfare, which they really popularized in the 90s, following obviously the collapse of the Soviet Union and the establishment of the unipolar world. And they thought, right, we won the world, sort of the Cold War. We are now the sole, force on the planet. They began to wage sanctions on any particular country that was even so much trying to, push back against, U.S. foreign interests, whether that was, Iraq, or any particular country. But I want to focus, I'm going to mention Iraq in this case because it was the impacts of the sanctions on Iraq cost, as I said before, the death of 1.5 million people. And then that wasn't enough. It continued to become a main source of, I guess, control and abuse throughout the world, sanctioning 25% of the world's population. And what that's eventually done is create the perfect conditions, as I've said many times, for countries to now seek alternative ways to engage in international trade, to cooperate with each other, and to try to push back against the dollar, to push back against and to rectify the mistakes of Bretton Woods. Even though, for example, BRICS, we've said before, has openly stated that they're not trying to provide an alternative, but in a way they are. Because what Marco Rubio is speaking about here, with the 20-year-long, trade agreement between China and Brazil, it speaks to that. South America, Latin America as a whole has been historically treated as, the United States' personal backyard. Funding drug cartels and drug wars that were purposefully meant to destroy. They were counter-revolutionary. They were meant to destroy revolutionary movements and democracies from being able to be established that were going to be self-sufficient. They did it because Latin America was a rich continent of itself. We're also seeing the consistent war that has not ended, for example, in Venezuela, because Venezuela is an oil hub. And obviously the United States wants to be able to control that oil, which it still does in a way, because they never allowed Venezuela to be able to establish its own refineries. That's only placed in the United States. And they did that strategically so that Venezuela would never have its own autonomy. But that's another topic. The point of the matter is that the United States, and its desire to abuse its monopoly on the world economy, actually it worked against that in the end, because it created incentives for countries to therefore look for alternatives. And that's what we're seeing now with Brazil, trading in its own currency, which means that the use of the dollar is going to diminish, which means that the United States' ability to be able to inflict pain through sanctions or control the world economy through its financial institutions is going to diminish. And interestingly, the United States itself becoming the world consumer, because the United States needs to be the world consumer in order to be able to pump out enough dollars, because that's the other angle as well behind this. The United States had to also export a lot of its industries abroad, because it needs to become the world consumer in order to produce enough dollars to put into the global economy if it's to be the world reserve currency. And in doing so, it's destroyed its own economy, its own industries at home, impacting the working class in the United States. This is known as the Triffin dilemma. But the irony now is it's destroying its own economies. It's become dependent on countries in the global south, who it's also abused with the dollar. And now basically everyone is trying to find a way to escape the dollar. And that's a problem for the United States, because it both depends on them, but also needs them to use the dollar. So this is the contradiction that it's of the United States at the present moment.
Yes, it is. And the great irony here is because of these policies, we've actually created the axis of upheaval. Gaddafi tried to de-dollarize, and you can see how that worked out. And after that, everybody started looking at like, okay, well, who's next? And, our foreign policy is just so incredibly stupid. We've sanctioned Iran to death. Well, actually, that's obviously not true to death, but to the point where they created this shadow fleet and now this overland rail system to sell cheaper oil, because they're under sanctions, to China, our major rival. And then because we've sanctioned Russia trying to cause like a palace coup in the Kremlin by attacking like the oligarchs that Putin's surrounded by and like the rich people, they thought there'd be a palace coup in the Kremlin. Obviously wasn't going to happen. Obviously didn't happen. But what it did was also force an increasing security relationship with Russia and Iran. And if you know anything about Russian imperial pre-Bolshevik history, the Persians really didn't like them, but now through necessity, they're having a completely hard reset with their strategic relationship. And also, we're because of our tariff policies and stupid economic policies, we now have China, South Korea, and Japan like all agreeing and working together, which, if you also know anything about that history, is also insane. It's just completely backfiring in every way.
I also just want to say something because you mentioned South Korea. I do find it interesting. The recent elections, the new president of South Korea is probably the most friendly and looking towards actually normalizing and maybe even looking towards reunification with North Korea. And he's making actual strides towards actually, improving the relations between North Korea and South Korea, which is an interesting development, especially for the United States. So, but that's why I said, its need to control, its need to maintain global, sort of monopolize the world economy, simply is not sustainable in the long run. It's not possible. And we always have to remember that these particular maneuvers, although they might seem irrational, they do serve the interests of a minority group of people. And that is the sort of the ruling class in the US, the ultra rich, not even the 1%, it's more like the 0.01% in the United States who have an abundant amount of power. And they're the ones that, and it's their sort of interests that are sort of dominating what even the United States foreign policy is essentially carrying out. And it's not like a conspiracy theory. This is the reality of the situation. This is sort of reported by Oxfam every year. I mean, these are the statistics. So this is just pretty much the United States trying to desperately hold on to its ability to be able to monopolize and continue to monopolize the world economy, but it's failing because it simply doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, you don't need to have an economics degree to be like, hey, this is not working. And plus, I mean, most economics degrees anyways are kind of silly, but in some ways, because they're always wrong. But it's the 0.1% and also the transnational security elite that want this. And let's turn now to, yes, obviously the theme is the axis of upheaval, but certain things need to be settled first before a strategic shift or a full commitment to, taking it to the axis of upheaval. And that is the Middle East needs to be secured. All right, Syria needs to be resolved. Lebanon needs to normalize with Israel. The Pan-Arab Abraham Accords have to be settled, and peace and stability need to be brought to West Asia under U.S. hegemonic control. To that end, let's talk about Lebanon and the Gulf states.
Oh, God.
Because honestly, West Asia does need to be settled before they can move on.
Right. So there's a couple of things. With regard, okay, so there's a lot obviously happening right now with Lebanon, and I don't know if you managed to take a look at the paper that I'd actually published, but there was like a lot. There was a lot to cover. Basically, in the last 5 days, actually, I would say in the last week, it's been very interesting because we've been seeing a lot of reports that are coming out from, obviously, we had the U.S. Special Envoy to Lebanon, which is also the U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, which is Tom Barrack. He's been making a lot of very provocative statements. One of the main provocative statements being essentially that he was issued warnings towards Lebanon that if they do not essentially disarm Hezbollah, that Lebanon risks an existential threat and effectively risks being occupied by Syria and Israel, which is very interesting because at the same time we have had reports coming out of Syria that basically, and in Israel and Israeli media, that there are talks happening behind the scenes between Israel and Syria in order to normalize, Tripoli, which is obviously the second largest city in Lebanon, will be handed over to Syria, essentially occupied by Syria. Obviously, this is interesting. These conversations are happening between Syria and Israel when, and Lebanon Lebanon itself, a sovereign country, is not even included in these conversations, and with what right and the audacity that Syria and Israel have, and the West, to be having these conversations to begin with, is highly problematic. However, at the same time as all this is happening, and I kind of outlined that in this particular article that I published, and people can go to look for the sources. In the last week, we've also seen the Washington Institute, hawkish think tank of its own, and the Chatham House, a British hawkish think tank as well.
Your alma mater.
Yeah, exactly. They've been publishing just the last 5 days again, a very aggressive policy papers at this point, saying that this is the moment of truth for Lebanon. Or, in terms of the Washington Institute policy paper, they were basically stating that this is not the time to let Lebanon go. Why? Because this is the opportune moment to try to actually completely destroy the acts of resistance by taking down Hezbollah. There has not been an opportunity in the last 20 years as pristine as this to justify this kind of attack on Lebanon, and in order to sort of destroy Hezbollah. And actually, if you look at what the Washington Institute actually said, they actually said that if we allow Hezbollah to be able to continue to exist, and they even, a direct quote would be that Hezbollah is now executing strategic concessions, aka moving behind the Litani River and trying to obviously adhere to some extent the ceasefire agreement, and for the most part trying to pacify themselves, is only strategic in order to then be able to mobilize and become more stronger down the line. And
Right,
that is correct. That is a correct analysis.
Yeah, and we're
Yeah.
seeing that echoed at Chatham House too. Hezbollah's game plan
Yeah.
is to cooperate minimally on disarmament to contain what it hopes is temporary international pressure, while gradually rebounding and staying deliberately vague about the future of its weapons. Obviously, Hezbollah is not going to lay down arms, and if they
Exactly.
do, they will cease to exist as an organization and as an entity. Their existential survival is dependent on having weapons. Now, whether or not they pull some stuff like the PKK did in Turkey and Syria, where they burned 20
No.
AK-47s, and they're like, okay, we're disarmed now, or so it could be something like that. But we don't need
I
to
will
get
say
in.
something.
Okay.
No, I would just say something I've come across. I do want to do an episode about this one day, but the Hezbollah as a resistance organization is far more authentic than the PKK, but I will leave it at that.
Yeah, you guys fight it out. You guys fight it out in the comments. One other
Yeah.
one other quote that I wanted to bring up from this paper is very telling. What Aoun and Salam, President Aoun and Salam should worry about is the risk that the U.S. loses interest in Lebanon and the country misses the train of peace and prosperity. And what the hell are they talking about here?
God knows what they're talking about. The U.S. will not lose it. It's the U.S. that's the guiding force behind these operations at the moment. So you got Tom Barrack,
and also, like, what about France? Lebanon's like still pretty much a neo-colony, half a world indebted to the IMF and World Bank too. So, like, what are they talking about? We have all the leverage, and we're not going to lose interest. We're building that monstrosity of an embassy, which is more of a regional intelligence hub in Beirut. Like, what?
Exactly. And like I said, if we're going to secure the region, if you want to secure West Asia under your control, you have to get rid of the resistance and anything that will anyway jeopardize that ability to be able to exercise that control. If you really want to turn, West Asia into an alternative to BRICS, or to destroy BRICS, or to establish IMEC, for example, and create these corridors between the Gulf states, between Saudi Arabia, through Syria and Turkey, and obviously Lebanon. And the reason I brought up Tripoli earlier is because it's important. Let me pull up and I want to highlight this. Tripoli itself is the second largest city in Lebanon, but it's also got one of the most important ports in the Eastern Mediterranean. And, much like Latakia in Syria, which is now effectively owned by French like for 30 years by a French multinational company, these particular locations, both of these ports are essentially going to serve, much like the Gaza port, which, the Gaza 2035 plan and the ambitions that they have for that, access that will connect Asia with Europe and the rest of the world. And in terms of providing not just, trade routes for, the trading of goods, but also obviously pipelines for oil into Europe, but also as a new means of exchange for AI. and connecting these new sort of, high-tech cities in Saudi Arabia and the UAE that they're trying to establish with, obviously, with the EU and the rest of the imperial core. And part of this process is, like I said many times before, is to directly bypass and undermine Iran, China, and Russia, and the operations, the BRI, the digital Silk Road that they were meaning to establish, and Iran was going to be the center for that. This is why those ports are very important, and they want to. And actually, I will also say this: Turkey yesterday was quite enraged, apparently, by the President Aoun's visit to Cyprus, that that Turkey viewed as President Aoun trying to undermine their interest in the Eastern Mediterranean, et cetera, et cetera. And the article that actually was published by Cradle had revealed sources within, Lebanese security that found that Syrian HTS affiliated kind of groups are smuggling weapons into Lebanon, that Turkey's directly involved in that process. And in addition to all this, Syria itself is also demanding, and we've also saw in the last couple of days we saw articles published about this as well. Syria itself, on top of the fact that there's negotiations going on behind the scenes for supposedly Syria taking over Tripoli, but Syria is openly also demanding that in order to normalize relations with Lebanon has to basically release at least 2,000 to 3,000 Syrian prisoners, of which the vast majority of them, again, according to Lebanese media, are terrorists. They have criminal records, they have connections to terrorist organizations, and therefore will be a threat to Lebanon if they're released, as well as to the border of Lebanon. And it's becoming a condition now for Syria. And the reason that Syria is doing this, and the reason Turkey is doing this, is that they're trying to mobilize these HTS affiliated groups, these organizations that we know have direct links or were directly connected to organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and use them now in the same way that they used them in Syria to bring about, I will call it regime change. They're now trying to use it to obviously threaten the sovereignty of Lebanon. And in fact, on July 1st, I think it was on July 1st, it was also on The Nation, the Lebanese, intelligence forces and police were able to thwart a major terrorist attack inside of Lebanon that, according to the article itself, mirrored that of the Israeli pager attack. And it was conducted by these individuals that are linked to these Syrian groups as well. And the article sort of that highlighted how there are many Syrian cells inside Lebanon that are probably going to be activated for the purpose, essentially, of creating internalized threats within Lebanon itself. And the idea behind this, and I'll just finish it off here, is to create the sort of circumstances by which, by having sort of any potential terrorist attack take place, or inter religious attacks between the different communities inside Lebanon, the West is trying to hope that it will start a civil war inside Lebanon one way or another, because this will be one of the ways by which they're going to try to undermine Hezbollah internally, because they cannot do it through direct military confrontation. Israel proved that it can't do it by even through the violent bombardment of Hezbollah or the south of Lebanon. So what they're going to try to do is instigate civil war, which, and actually this would be my last point, Tom Barrack himself also admitted that if the Lebanese state is cornered enough to basically accept that that they're going to take action forward towards the disarmament of Hezbollah, would also itself bring about a civil war in the country due to the loyalties of a huge fraction of the Lebanese population has towards Hezbollah. So from whatever angle you look at it, actually, yeah, it's a good point. From whatever angle that you look at it, the West, alongside the Gulf states, because they are also directly involved, given how many of the Saudi princes have been visiting Lebanon in the last couple of weeks, demanding disarmament of Hezbollah. Oh, and including Riyadh is also blackmailed Lebanon that it will not be receiving financial aid to reconstruct the infrastructure that's been destroyed since the war, unless Hezbollah has basically disarmed.
And it's not just Riyadh; it's also Washington too.
Yeah, that's why I brought it up, because I know we're going to discuss that now. But all of this is geared towards effectively cornering the Lebanese state to do something it doesn't really want to do because it understands the implications. But there will be civil war in Lebanon one way or another in order to try to target Hezbollah.
Yeah, if they can't squeeze them out by trying to block their access to global markets and currency, if they can't do it through isolating them politically, they'll try to do it militarily. And a direct confrontation with the Lebanese army and Hezbollah is not going to go very well. So if they can do it through sectarian violence, all the better. And I just want to say, like, you talk about like destroying the axis of resistance. The reason Hezbollah is getting the main bulk right now, obviously because it's the biggest threat, but also we have no leverage over Yemen. We have we don't have the same political leverage over the Houthis too. The Houthis need to go, but we don't really know what to do about them right now. So we're just going to put that over to the side and focus on Hezbollah, putting out one brush fire at a time, because, we just don't have the same governmental and pressure that we can exert over Hodeidah, essentially. And they've obviously been living under what could be generously called an austerity economy, just basically starving people to death via sanctions in Yemen for a long time. So they're pretty resilient to whatever we can do, unless we want to put boots on the ground, which is not going to happen. Well, the Houthis are just going to have to wait, and hopefully we'll keep I think the BBC World did this documentary where they had pretty conclusive evidence that one of the Al-Qaeda planners for the attack on the USS Cole the year before 9/11 was actually, working for U.S. intelligence services to target Houthi leaders. So, we've got our own sectarian dirty work that we're trying to use to destabilize Houthi control in Yemen. But no, it's really about Lebanon, and it's not really about Iran. People are saying it's, we need to take out Iran for Israel. Yeah, sure. But we also need to take it out for our empire too, so we can shift towards our real rival, China. And this region needs to be secured. Again, I just want to drill down on that, because the war in Ukraine is going to keep going on. I think we've established it's not going to end, but we really need, and this is one of the big frustrations with a lot of people in the defense circles. And I was just in Washington talking to a few, and they're not monoliths. There are different thoughts and coalitions within the think tank world and the command echelon and the Pentagon. A lot of people are freaking frustrated that this Gaza thing is still going on, because they're trying to get out of the Middle East, secure it. They're very happy with how Syria is going, because obviously normalization is going to happen, et cetera, for sanctions relief, whatever. They need the region to die down so they can actually shift assets from CENTCOM, which is the combatant command for the Middle East, over to Indo-PACCOM. And they've been waiting to do this for years, but we keep getting bogged down in West Asia. And I know a lot of people are frustrated by that. So there is definitely a push within these defense circles to wrap it up. And if you can't do it militarily, they'll do it politically.
The thing is, you can't really, so what I was going to say is you can't really do that in West Asia. So, going back to the points that we were trying to make, right? If you're trying to rival China, if you're trying to cut Iran off, because another aspect behind, obviously, kind of taking out Hezbollah essentially, and sort of bringing about a new kind of political reality in Lebanon that will be normalized within the Abrahamic Accords, rather like similar to, for example, Syria. If this begins to take shape, then you are also isolating and encircling Iran, which then they will try to use to be able to kind of squeeze Iran one way or another, and to break Iran as well. So if you're trying to do that in order to therefore have, take down China at some future point, and then probably Pakistan, etc., you obviously do need to secure West Asia. That's obviously my interpretation of it. So I can kind of see why they kind of end up getting boggled down in West Asia, because the situation is chaotic. Gaza is still obviously, the genocide is still going on. Hamas is still obviously still as strong, going strong as it has pretty much since October 7th. Even though it's taking severe losses, it's managed to recuperate rather quickly, and still apparently has enough weapons and ammunition that the Israeli occupation forces tend to also abandon in bulks after they retreat from particular areas. So they're able to still exercise that power. But also obviously, like the Chatham House article said, if you don't deal with Hezbollah now, it would just continue to grow, and it will infiltrate into Syria, Iraq, etc. Because this is the thing with regards to Syria as well. Syria, and under Jolani or al-Shara, whatever you want to call him, hasn't been able to consolidate power. Look at the state of Syria today alone. You have the Bedouins who are at war with the Druze, who you have. There's like, that's been, I don't know if you're aware of this, but as of February 1st, 2025, for example, there's been a group that was always part of HTS that split from HTS. They call themselves the Soraya Ansar Sunnah, who themselves are, pretty much that they are HTS, but they've kind of separated from HTS, de jure in order to be able to carry out the kind of operations that HTS would want to do anyway. And that, they're the ones that are engaging in like the bombings of the Mar Elias Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Church, killing 30 Christian Syrians. They're also the ones that have been conducting raids and massacres against the Alawites. And you can see the state of Syria for the better part, I would say, is in a civil war. All the different fractions, communities, and religious sects, there is no unity, and this is going to continue. So if you as the West are trying to establish Syria, who they've lifted the sanctions off of them, and I think it's the United States and I think the UAE. I can't remember now. So please, I might not be accurate, but they're the ones that are going to be building the electricity infrastructure, and the French have bought out Latakia port for the next 30 years. And I think as well, Qatar has come in and they're investing another 800 billion now in, other forms of infrastructure. They are trying their best to essentially create, Qatar has actually now also bought another port inside Syria in order to supposedly make it a huge sort of port in terms of the trade plans that they have for the region. So you can see the Gulf monarchies and the West is coming in to try to create a state out of Syria. But as far as I can see it, it's a failed state. They won't be able to, consolidate that. So if you allow Hezbollah to remain, at some point in the future, the resistance will come through again, more powerful, and will completely undermine Syria and all their plans in the region. That's my opinion anyway.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Like, the bottom line is, I don't think Hezbollah is going to cease to exist, and they're only going to get stronger the longer they're allowed to exist. So, yeah, it's kind of a predicament, and so they're trying to leverage really hard both the Syrian and Lebanese governments. And if you want to look at foreign actors in Syria right now getting involved in owning their infrastructure, this is kind of a prelude with what's going to happen in Ukraine. Like they're going to basically be owned by foreign landlords. All right. So basically, so Syria. Okay. First of all, a consortium of Qatari, Turkish, and American companies that's going to rebuild their electricity infrastructure. World Bank has approved 146 million grant. A grant from the World Bank to support the restoration of Syria's energy sector. This grant will finance Syria's electricity emergency progress, SEEP, and will fund the rehabilitation of high voltage transmission lines that Israel was so kind to bomb. They always do our dirty work so we can come in and, after Israel bombs everything, we'd be like, hey, you guys want a World Bank loan that you totally won't be problematic in the future? It's almost like it's all part of the same imperial system. And then Turkey, of course, has been actively involved in Syria's energy sector. It already supplies, of course, electricity to areas like Idlib and has been for some time. Yeah. And, in cahoots with Qatar, they've agreed to deploy floating power supply vessels to deliver electricity to Syria. Yeah. Okay. So that's basically that's a taste of what's gonna happen to Ukraine too. It's all
that's already happening in Ukraine.
It's crazy how our playbook is always the same.
Of course, it's already happening in Ukraine. I mean, its entire mineral rights and resources have been, essentially signed off to the United States. Whatever is left of them, anyway. The country's essentially its assets are being kind of bought out by Western corporations. It's essentially being, sold to private capital. It's the same thing is happening in Syria. Another core reason that they wanted to get rid of Assad as well is because Assad was kind of decided that he was going to align and create trade routes and pipelines with Iran and Russia and Iraq and sort of bypass the Western objectives, which is another reason why they want to get rid of him. It's not because they love democracy so much or because they really care whether he was authoritarian or not. They don't. If he was authoritarian, I mean, if he remained an authoritarian but abided by Western interests, they would love him as an authoritarian. They wouldn't give a. They wouldn't care. So I don't want to swear on the podcast, but
no, they wouldn't care. You know, if
they wouldn't care.
If he aligned with their interests, they would have been like, you know what, Assad, he's a strong guy, great ally. We're just going to completely ignore the fact that he's a bourgeois dictator who lets his army do whatever it wants. No, he would be a great friend. But of course, he picked to side with the Axis of Upheaval. So you don't get to be an authoritarian ruler without, signing on to Western.
And it's also worth noting that Syria, the one positive thing that at least Syrians had under, Assad in general, is that they did have certain welfare that the Syrians had access to. They had some of the best healthcare, national healthcare in not just in the region, but even in the northern part of Africa, that even paralleled in some instances to some of the European states. He was able to offer in that aspect. Although late in the last, I think probably from 2007 onwards, he did try to bring in more liberalism within the markets and sort of try to bring some privatization into the market, but still,
there's a lot of there's a whole lot of shit with the Assad regime, including the insane cronyism within the government, and
there is
their own Pentagon drug trade. But I guess the point I wanted to make, and I kind of have a doctor's appointment here in a second, but
okay, cool.
Was basically, this is all the playbook. This is our playbook. None of this is surprising. If you don't understand it by now, I don't know what else to tell you. Regardless of how you feel about the Ukrainian government or the new Syrian government, this is what we are trying to do. We are trying to create a vassal state through regional allies like the Gulf states, which are now apparently going to get involved in Ukraine somehow, and other interests like Turkey, in order to dominate these governments that were once recalcitrant and not under our control.
Can I just say something about as well these comprador states, whether it's Turkey, the Gulf states, etc. One of the other issues that the West is going to encounter sooner or later, we're going to start seeing it in Lebanon as well as we've already seen it in Syria, is that at the end of the day, these countries, although they have vested interest in Western capital, they also have their own interests that don't always align with each other. So, for example, we already saw that sort of somewhat take place in Syria with conflicting interests between Turkey and Israel, and also between Saudi Arabia, etc. So, and we're going to probably see the same thing happening in Lebanon in the upcoming weeks, next couple of months. So, just something to bear in mind. I would say that that's another reason why I think the Western plans in the region are also going to fail, because not only can you not secure a region where you've put radicals into power essentially that are now out of control, but sometimes, although they breed chaos, they won't be able to secure the region enough to establish their own plans. And also their comprador states are probably going to have conflicting interests, because, for example, Israel itself and its own plans and ambitions do contradict those of, for example, Jordan and Egypt in many ways as well. For example, their plans for the Gazans, and obviously expelling the Gazans. So from whatever angle you look at it, I don't really see the West being able to solidify and consolidate the West Asia, and I don't really see them being able to achieve much in Ukraine either, outside of eventually the entirety of their projects that they're pushing for war everywhere, and this investment in NATO and weapons and destroying economies. It's going to essentially boomerang back onto the Western economies that are so reliant on, like I said, on the global South, but also because of the impact that these wars are having, and all the funds that are going towards funding them, and the destruction of their own economies is actually going to boomerang back to the European Union and the US.
Yeah, basically we're basically pillaging our entire tax base to make rich people richer. That's kind of the main theme here. And when it comes to fighting the Axis of Upheaval, securing Asia, beating Russia and Ukraine, what has our track record been for the past 20 years? Look, it's not been great, okay? And a lot of these foreign policy crypt keepers that have been around in Washington since they were like interns during the Bay of Pigs, They haven't been right about anything ever. So look, it's really not gonna work out. And I do have to go. I just wanted to end. I hope we introduced you to some connective tissue between all these different countries that we're now calling the Axis of Upheaval. I love how we always have to take out the same toolkit. We were the good guys in World War II, so we're going to fight the Axis of Evil, which I agree that, Nazi Germany, Mussolini, Franco, and Imperial Japan weren't great. But since then, we've been like riding on the glory days. And so like when George Bush first declared the war in Iraq, he also took the Axis of Evil out of there, and now we're reinventing it for World War III. It's kind of crazy, and it's not going to work. And yeah, guys, I think that's about it for me.
Just make literally a one-liner. Always important to remember as well, like the Axis. What you just mentioned, Franco and even Nazi Germany, funded and supported by Western capital every step of the way. They even basically put in, like, they even gave Franco admissions into NATO afterwards. Like, that's the irony. They do enjoy, they tend to be the number one sponsors of fascism, because it actually is meant to squash any actual revolutionary movement at all times. They prefer that as opposed to actually having countries be autonomous and seek prosperity for themselves.
Wasn't it like in the late 50s and 60s, like 2 consecutive NATO supreme commanders were ex-Nazi generals? Weird. That's a whole different historical rabbit hole that we're gonna get down. But yeah,
that's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. But I just wanted to play a moment of Zen for you guys before we wrap up. And this is Trump yesterday at the prayer luncheon for the White House Faith Office. And it's very endemic of what drives this administration and every other previous administration under the U.S. capitalism.
Hard. And the alternative is one of two things. You can either get all these things and make the economy strong, or you're going to literally have perhaps a depression where you people, so rich, so beautiful, so nice to look at, will be totally busted. And let's see how long your wife stays with you. You're beautiful. She'll stay with you for about 3 weeks, and she'll say, darling, I can't take it anymore. I can't take it anymore, darling. I'm leaving you. I said to one guy, he's a very, very unattractive man, but he's smart. And he's rich. And I said, you better hope we get this thing passed, because your wife will be gone within about 2 minutes. He said, you're right.
Till death do us part, unless, you have to maximize shareholder profits or whatever. So anyways, that was the dystopian faith luncheon at the White House. So it's kind of crazy. It almost makes you realize that, all the Nazis were Catholics and Lutherans, and they went to church every Sunday. So on that note, this has been the Axis of Upheaval episode. I hope it was informative. I'm taking a break. I'm only doing one episode this week on Colonial Outcasts because we're working on a new project. You guys will see maybe Thursday if you're lucky. So thanks, Alina, so much for coming on, but I got to wrap this show up.
Oh, yeah, it was great. It was a nice conversation. And yeah, look forward to the next one.
All right. Cheers, y'all. We will see you soon. And we are on Patreon if you want the weekly Friday episode, which is a big hit. So hope to see you then. Have a great week.